Everything you were told about how to reach an avoidant was wrong. Not slightly off, not missing a nuance or two, not in need of minor adjustment. Fundamentally, structurally, at the level of the core premise, wrong. You were told that openness builds bridges. That vulnerability invites vulnerability. That consistent love, offered generously and without the artificial drama of withholding, creates the safety that allows a defended person to gradually lower their walls and meet you in the open. You were told that patience is the currency of connection with someone who is afraid of closeness. That understanding their psychology is the key that unlocks their capacity for presence. That if you could just get the calibration right, just enough warmth without too much pressure, just enough availability without obvious need, just enough expression without the emotional intensity that sends them retreating, the avoidant would eventually, incrementally become the partner you needed them to be. And you tried. You tried with everything you had. You calibrated and adjusted and softened and expanded and reached and waited and reached again. And the result was not the gradual opening you were promised. The result was a dynamic in which your consistent investment became the very thing that removed the conditions required for their consistent investment to feel necessary. In which your love became furniture, present, reliable, taken for granted, not particularly noticed until the day it was gone. And the day it was gone, the day your silence finally replaced your reaching, something happened in the avoidant that all your calibrated warmth and all your patient understanding and all your carefully offered love had never managed to produce. Something ignited. And understanding why, understanding the specific, deep, psychologically precise reason why your silence does what nothing else can do to the interior of an avoidant who genuinely feels something for you, is what this entire conversation is about. The foundation of everything that follows requires a single, clear, non-negotiable statement that must be established before any of the psychology can be properly understood. The silence being discussed here is not a tactic. It is not a move in a game. It is not the manufactured withdrawal of someone who read somewhere that playing hard to get activates avoidant desire and decided to test the theory. It is not strategic distance deployed with one eye on the avoidance response, monitoring for the desired reaction, ready to end the silence the moment sufficient activation has been achieved. That version of silence, performed, calculated, organized around the avoidance response rather than around your own genuine experience, is not what ignites anything real or lasting. Avoidants, whose nervous systems are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional atmosphere of their relational environment, feel the difference between genuine withdrawal and performed withdrawal at a level below conscious thought. The performed version produces mild, temporary discomfort that normalizes quickly. It is waited out, it does not reach the depth required to move anything significant. The silence that ignites is the silence that arrives when you have genuinely, honestly, completely stopped. When the reaching and the absorbing, and the patient investment in a dynamic that kept not meeting you in it, has finally exhausted itself. When the orientation of your attention has shifted, not because you decided to shift it as a strategy, but because the shift became the only honest thing left. When your silence is not about them and what it will produce in them, but about you and what you require to continue functioning as a whole person. That silence, the one that is genuinely self-directed, that has no performance in it because there is no audience it is playing for, is the one that changes everything. And everything that follows is an explanation of why. To understand why genuine silence ignites avoidant passion in a way that consistent presence cannot, you need to understand the specific structure of avoidant desire. Not desire in the general human sense. The particular idiosyncratic, profoundly misunderstood architecture of desire in someone whose attachment system was built in the specific conditions of avoidant development. Avoidant attachment forms in environments where emotional need was not reliably met, where reaching for closeness produced, with enough consistency to become a formative lesson, the experience of the reach going unanswered, where the expression of need led to dismissal or suffocation, or the specific confusing experience of love that was present but not emotionally available. Where a child learned, in the wordless and permanent way that early lessons are learned, that meeting people is dangerous and that self-sufficiency is the only reliable source of safety. From that foundation, the developing person builds an architecture around a central premise. Closeness is threatening. Not because they do not want it. The wanting is as present and as powerful in an avoidant as in anyone else, perhaps more so precisely because it was early frustrated, but because the wanting, when followed, has historically led to pain. So the desire gets complicated. It gets filtered, it gets organized around a set of conditions that allow it to be felt without the feeling producing the vulnerability it would naturally produce in a person with less defended attachment. And the central condition around which avoidant desire organizes is this: the object of desire must not be fully secured, must retain some quality of the not quite certain, must exist in the specific register of the genuinely wanted rather than the comfortably had. This is not pathology for its own sake. It is the logical, adaptive outcome of a desire system that learned to protect itself from the pain of losing what it needed by never fully arriving at the place where having it was certain. If you never fully have it, you can never fully lose it. And the desire, kept at the specific temperature of not quite having, remains available without the terrifying vulnerability of genuine possession. Your consistent presence, your reliable availability, your generously offered and patiently maintained love, these things, whatever their genuine worth and however deeply they were felt, could not satisfy this architecture. Not because they were insufficient as expressions of love, because they were doing the one thing the avoidance desire system most effectively shuts down in response to. They were resolving the uncertainty. Every time you reached after their withdrawal, you resolved the uncertainty. Every time your availability proved stable across their distance, you confirmed that the floor would hold. Every time your love proved resilient to their pattern, you demonstrated that the having was secured. And secured having, for a desire system organized around the not quite certain, is the precise condition under which desire quiets. Not disappears. Quiets. Goes to a manageable, livable, undemanding level that does not produce urgency. Does not produce the specific activation that avoidant desire requires to become loud enough to override the fear of vulnerability. Does not compete with the comfort of the current configuration, distance maintained, presence available but not pressing, the arrangement that allows for the warmth of connection without the cost of genuine commitment to it. Your love, in other words, was being held at the temperature of comfortable. And comfortable, for avoidant desire, is a sedative. Your silence changes the temperature entirely, not incrementally, not by degrees, with the specific, immediate, physiological quality of something that has moved from one register to an entirely different one. The comfortable becomes uncertain, the secured becomes at risk. The floor that was always there reveals itself, in the moment of its absence, to have been the primary structural support of something the avoidant did not know they were depending on, until the support was gone. What happens in the avoidant's interior world when genuine silence arrives is worth walking through with precision, because the precision illuminates both why the ignition is real and why on its own it is not sufficient. The first experience is the one already discussed, the disruption of the model, the internal framework that had your availability filed as constant encounters information that does not fit the framework. The automatic reflexive response is to dismiss the information as temporary, a blip, a mood, something that will normalize when whatever is happening with you normalizes. The avoidant waits for this normalization with a confidence that is, at its root, the confidence of assumption rather than the confidence of evidence. When the normalization does not come, when the silence extends past what the model predicted, when the days accumulate and the reaching does not resume, the second experience begins. Anxiety, not displayed anxiety, contained, internal, carefully managed anxiety. The kind that shows on the outside as ordinary life continuing, while on the inside the preoccupation with you and the silence and what it means begins to take up significantly more bandwidth than the ordinary operation of daily life requires. This anxiety is the first evidence of the ignition beginning. Not passion yet, the precursor to passion, the specific, low-level, difficult-to-manage activation of an attachment system that is registering against its usual operational parameters, something that functions like threat. Not threat in the dangerous sense, threat in the relational sense, the possibility of genuine loss, the specific activated quality of something mattering enough that its potential absence registers as a problem requiring attention rather than a situation requiring management. The third experience is where the ignition properly occurs, and it arrives when the anxiety has been running long enough and the silence has continued long enough and the usual strategies for managing unwanted feeling have been deployed long enough without producing relief. That the desire, which has been at its comfortable, managed, livable level for the entire duration of the dynamic, suddenly exceeds the containment. It becomes loud, specifically, urgently, unmistakably loud, in a way that the comfortable version never was. And the loudness has a quality that is entirely different from the quality of desire that was present during the dynamic. Because it is no longer organized around the not quite certain, it has moved past not quite certain into genuinely at risk. And genuinely at risk is the register in which avoidant desire is most fully, most loudly, most completely alive. The passion that ignites in this register is not manufactured. It is not the product of a strategy working as designed. It is the avoidant's genuine feeling for you, which was always present, always real, always running beneath the comfortable surface of the managed dynamic, finally breaking through the containment that comfort provided. The feeling did not change. What changed is the volume. What changed is the urgency. What changed is the specific overriding quality of something that has gone from manageable to pressing, from livable to impossible, to continue living without addressing. This is the explosion. Not cinematic, not performed. The internal explosion of feeling that has been quiet for too long, finally finding a volume that cannot be managed back down to something comfortable. Now, what does this look like in practice? What does the ignited passion actually produce in the avoidance behavior? And how do you recognize it accurately rather than through the distorting lens of either hope or cynicism? The first behavioral signature is a change in the quality of any contact that occurs. If there is contact, and if the connection was genuine and the silence has extended long enough, there tends to be some form of contact. It carries a different texture from the contact of the managed dynamic. It is slightly less careful, slightly less composed. It has the quality of something that got ahead of the usual editing process. A message sent before the filter fully engaged. A reaching that moved faster than the defense could intercept it. The words themselves may not be dramatic, but the quality of their arrival, the timing, the tone, the absence of the deliberate composure that characterized communication during the dynamic, signals something that is moving from a different place than usual. The second signature is the indirect monitoring becoming more active and more visible. The checking on your situation through whatever channels are available. The attention paid to any information about how you are doing. The awareness of your presence or absence in shared spaces that goes beyond casual noticing into something more like tracking. This monitoring is the desire expressing itself through the safest available channel, the one that requires no direct exposure, no acknowledged reaching, no vulnerability of contact, but the intensity of it, which tends to increase as the silence continues, is itself a form of evidence. You do not monitor this closely, things that do not matter. The third signature is the most significant and the most easy to misread. It is the return of the specific quality of attention that characterized the best moments of the connection, the quality of being genuinely, completely seen by someone who is paying attention with their whole self rather than the managed fraction that comfortable dynamics produce. If and when contact occurs, this quality is different from the baseline of the dynamic. It has the slightly raw, slightly unguarded quality of someone who has been in genuine discomfort and has arrived at the interaction from that discomfort rather than from the composed position of someone managing their emotional temperature. Here is the place where honesty is most required and most easily bypassed. Because the ignited passion is real, the explosion of feeling is genuine, the avoidant who reaches after genuine silence is reaching from something true rather than from something performed. And all of that, the reality of it, the genuineness of it, the specific and sometimes devastating confirmation that yes, the feeling was always there and the connection was always real, produces a pull in you that is among the most powerful forces available in relational life. The pull toward the ignited passion, the pull toward the warmth of the return, the pull toward the confirmation that the love was mutual, that the investment was not wasted, that the specific and irreplaceable quality of what existed between you was not a projection of your own hoping, but a genuine, reciprocal, real thing. This pull deserves acknowledgement. It is real, and it is human, and it is completely understandable. You loved this person, or you love them still, and encountering the evidence that the love was returned, in the activated, urgent, finally breaking through form of ignited avoidant passion, touches something in you that months of careful healing could not entirely close. But the pull toward the ignited passion must be distinguished, clearly and without the softening of hope, from the pull toward genuine change in the dynamic. These are not the same thing. The passion igniting is evidence of the feeling being real. It is not evidence of the patterns having changed. It is not evidence of the architecture having shifted. It is not evidence that what was absent during the comfortable dynamic, the consistency, the reliable presence, the daily evidence of being chosen that you needed and deserved, is now available simply because the urgency of potential loss has temporarily made the feeling louder. Loud feeling is not the same as changed behavior. Urgency is not the same as growth. The ignited passion, without the underlying work of actually interrupting the avoidant patterns that made the silence necessary in the first place, is the same desire in a different key. It will resolve, as all peak states resolve, when the urgency normalizes. And when the urgency normalizes, when your presence is again comfortable and available, and no longer the subject of genuine uncertainty, the desire will quiet again to its manageable, comfortable level. And the cycle restarts. This is the knowledge that is hardest to hold and most essential to hold. That the ignition, real and significant as it is a beginning at best. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, not the thing that was missing from the dynamic finally arriving in its proper form. It is a door opening. Whether anything real walks through it depends entirely on what the avoidant does with the activation. Whether they use it to reach back toward the comfortable configuration as quickly as possible, or whether they use it as the honest, finally undeniable evidence of what the dynamic cost and what their patterns produced, and turn that evidence towards genuine reckoning and genuine change. You will be able to tell which is happening, not immediately, not in the first contact or the first interaction, but in what follows. In whether the accountability deepens over time, or whether the warmth of reconnection is used to close the subject before it has been properly opened, in whether the reaching that the passion produced continues after the urgency normalizes, or whether it was contingent on the urgency and fades with it, in whether they are doing the actual specific unglamorous work of changing the patterns that made the silence necessary, or whether they are performing enough of the appearance of that work to restore the comfortable configuration without the actual structural change that would make the configuration genuinely different. What your silence gave you, independent of what it produced in them, independent of whether the ignition leads anywhere real, is something that deserves its own naming before this conversation closes. It gave you the experience of your own sufficiency, of discovering, in the specific and embodied way that only lived experience provides, that your life has gravity and substance and worth that does not depend on the avoidance engagement with it to be real. That the version of yourself that exists when you are not organized around the monitoring of someone else's emotional temperature is a version that is more fully, more recognizably, more genuinely you than the version that was running during the dynamic. This is not a small gift. In many ways, it is the most significant thing the entire experience can offer. Because the person who discovered their own sufficiency, who found, in the quiet of genuine withdrawal, that they are interesting and worthy and capable of a full life that does not require the avoidance participation to be complete, that person is not available to the same dynamic in the same way. They bring something different to any re-engagement. A different baseline, a different tolerance for insufficiency, a different relationship to the uncertainty that avoidant desire requires, because the uncertainty no longer lands in someone who needs the resolution of it to feel okay. It lands in someone who is already okay. And already okay, as has been established throughout everything in this conversation, is the condition that most fundamentally changes what is possible in the dynamic. The silence also gave you clarity about the nature of the connection, and clarity in the context of avoidant dynamics is one of the rarest and most valuable things available. Because these dynamics specialize in ambiguity, in the never quite defined, never fully resolved, always slightly uncertain quality of something that is real but never completely present. And living in that ambiguity for extended periods does something to your perception of what is real and what is projected, what the connection actually is and what you need it to be. Your silence cut through the ambiguity, not by resolving it in the external sense, not by producing the clear, declared, mutually acknowledged definition of the connection that the ambiguity always prevented, but by producing, in the avoidance reaction to your absence, information that the comfortable presence of the dynamic never could. Because how someone responds to the genuine prospect of losing something tells you more about how much they value it than how they behave when the having is comfortable and secured. The ignition is that information, painful and clarifying in equal measure. It tells you the feeling was real, that you were not projecting depth onto something shallow, that the connection mattered in ways the dynamic surface behavior never fully communicated, that the love you gave was going somewhere even when it was not being adequately returned. That knowledge is worth having, even if it hurts. even if it complicates the clean story of moving on, even if it makes the clarity of simply letting go more difficult than ignorance would have been. Because you deserve to know the truth of what existed, not the comfortable fiction of either it was never real or it will work now because the passion has finally arrived. The truth is more complicated than either of those. It always is, with real things. And you are someone who can hold complicated truths without needing them to resolve into something simpler. That capacity, developed through everything this dynamic asked of you, is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most genuinely rare and genuinely valuable capacities available to a person navigating love. The capacity to see clearly without the distortion of either hope or bitterness. To know what was real without using the knowing as a reason to return to something insufficient. To hold the love and the limits simultaneously, without collapsing either one into the other. That is where your silence brought you. To the clear, honest, fully inhabited place of someone who knows what they had, knows what it cost, knows what the ignition means and what it does not mean, and knows, finally, solidly, without the need for the avoidance confirmation to make it true, exactly what they deserve next. Not the explosion of someone else's passion, however real. Your own. Quiet, steady, entirely self-generated, not dependent on another person's fear of loss to activate it. The passion of a person who finally, completely chose themselves. And found in that choosing the ground that does not give way. That ground is yours now, and nothing that comes next, no return, no reignition, no avoidant finally arriving at the door with all the feeling that the silence produced, can take it from you, because it was never theirs to give. It was always yours to find. You found it. The finding of it is not a moment. This is worth saying clearly, because the cultural narrative around personal reclamation tends to present it as an event, a specific identifiable turning point after which everything is different, after which the clarity is permanent and the ground is solid and the pull toward the old dynamic has lost its force entirely. That narrative is comforting and largely false. The finding is a process, a daily, sometimes hourly, occasionally minute-by-minute process of returning to the ground rather than a single arrival at it. There will be days when the ground feels completely solid, when the clarity is clean and the self-sufficiency is genuine, and the version of yourself that exists outside the dynamic feels more real and more inhabitable than any version that existed inside it. Days when the ignited passion, if it has made itself known, lands as information rather than as temptation. When you can hold the knowledge of their feeling without being moved by it in the destabilizing way you might have been moved months earlier. When the love you still carry, if you carry it, sits peacefully in you rather than pulling urgently toward expression or resolution. And there will be other days when the ground is less solid, when something, a specific quality of light, a song, a random and entirely unpredictable sensory detail that connects to something from the dynamic, brings the whole weight of it back with a specificity and an immediacy that the careful work of healing seems, in that moment, to have done nothing to prepare you for. When the ignited passion, arriving in whatever form it takes, finds a version of you that is less armored against its pull than you would like, when the old reaching impulse reasserts itself with a force that is humbling in its persistence, these days are not evidence of failure. They are not proof that the ground you found was illusory or that the healing has not been real. They are the honest texture of what it looks like to rewire something that was deeply grooved. The grooves do not disappear because you understood something new about yourself. They fade through the repetition of returning, through the accumulated practice of noticing the pull and choosing again the ground, not dramatically, not with the effortful quality of someone straining against something. With the patient, almost gentle quality of someone who knows where home is and keeps going back to it even on the days when the distance between where they are and where home is feels longer than it should. There is something specific about the way the ignited passion tends to arrive. And it is worth addressing here because it is the moment at which the ground is most tested and the most important to hold. That has a quality unlike almost any other relational experience. It tends to arrive when you are least defended against it, not because the avoidant has calculated the timing, though it may feel that way, but because the architecture of the dynamic means that the moments when you have most genuinely released your grip on the outcome, the moments when the detachment is most real and most embodied, rather than performed, are precisely the moments when the avoidance activation is most fully ignited. Your genuine release is what the ignition requires, and so the passion tends to arrive when the release is truest, when the silence is most completely genuine, when you are least oriented toward the dynamic and most fully living your own life. And the arrival in that moment, when your guard is genuinely down because you were not guarding, because you were simply living, has a particular piercing quality. It reaches into the genuine openness of someone who stopped waiting and finds in that openness a vulnerability to being moved that the braced, monitoring, still hoping version of you was paradoxically more protected against. Because bracing is its own kind of armor, and you have taken the armor off. And the passion, arriving in the unarmored space, lands with the full weight of what it is. This is not a reason to put the armor back on. The armor was costing you the openness that makes a genuine life possible. The openness that will allow the right things, the things that deserve your unarmored self, to land with the same fullness when they arrive. The vulnerability to being moved by the ignited passion is the same vulnerability that will allow you to be moved by everything worth being moved by. You cannot be selectively open. The openness is total, or it is performance. What you can do, what the ground provides, is be moved without being swept away. Feel the pull without following it blindly. Allow the arrival to land and acknowledge it honestly. Yes, this is real. Yes, this is significant. Yes, I feel this. And then, from the steadiness of the ground, make a conscious choice about what the feeling calls for, rather than simply being carried by it into whatever the feeling's momentum would produce. That is not distance. That is not the cold, managed, defended non-response of someone who has hardened against the possibility of being reached. That is the full present, genuinely feeling response of someone who has enough internal ground beneath them to respond from choice rather than from the urgency of activation. The choice, when the ignited passion arrives, has several honest options, and each of them deserves to be examined without the distortion of either the hope that wants one to be obviously right or the self-protection that wants another to be obviously safe. The first option is to allow the silence to continue, to receive the information that the ignition provides, the confirmation that the feeling was real, that the connection mattered, that the dynamic was not the projection of your own longing onto something hollow, and to hold that information as exactly what it is, without converting it into a reason to return to the dynamic in its current form, without using the reality of their feeling as evidence that the dynamic can become what it was not. The silence continues not as punishment and not as strategy, but as the honest expression of a person who requires more than ignited passion as qualification for re-engagement. Who requires the evidence, over time, that the patterns that made the silence necessary are actually being addressed. This option is the hardest to hold because it requires tolerating the specific discomfort of having confirmation of what you always hoped was real and choosing not to act on it in the most obvious way. It requires holding the love and the limit in the same hand simultaneously. And it requires trusting, against the urgency of the moment and the genuine pull of the feeling, that what you require is worth waiting for even when what is being offered is real and present, and reaching toward you right now. The second option is a conditional re-engagement, a willingness to allow contact, to respond to the reaching, to be in conversation, to be present in the dynamic again, while holding clearly, without apology, the requirements that genuine repair demands. This option is not the same as returning to the old configuration. It is the beginning of a different negotiation, one in which your availability is no longer the assumed constant of the dynamic, but something that is present and real and conditional on the dynamic being genuinely different from what it has been. This option requires the most precision and the most ongoing honesty. Because the pull towards slipping back into the old configuration, in which your availability is simply there, and the dynamic resumes its familiar patterns with the ignited passion gradually quieting back to the comfortable level, is strongest in the context of re-engagement. The conditional nature of the re-engagement must be real and not merely declared. It must be visible in actual behavior, in what you engage with, in what you decline, in what you require and what you hold to, in the specific ways you demonstrate that your presence is no longer the guaranteed flaw of a dynamic that does not earn it. The third option is the one that the pull of the ignited passion makes hardest to see as genuinely available. The option of not returning at all. Of holding the knowledge that the feeling was real and the connection was genuine and the ignition is authentic. And choosing, from the clear-eyed honesty of someone who knows what the dynamic has cost and what it has consistently failed to provide, that real and genuine and authentic is not sufficient on its own. That love without the architecture to sustain it is not the love you are building your life on. That the ignited passion, however moving, is a peak state that will normalize. And the normalized state has been demonstrated consistently and over time to be insufficient for what you actually need. This option is not bitterness. It is not the defensive hardness of someone who has been hurt enough to close off the possibility of being reached. It is the dignified, self-respecting, fully loving choice of someone who loves themselves enough to require that love be offered in a form that is actually livable. Day after day, in the ordinary texture of a relationship that is not primarily characterized by the drama of almost losing and the relief of returning, but by the quiet, consistent, undramatic presence of two people who choose each other freely and repeatedly, and without the architecture of fear structuring the choosing. Here is what you know that you did not know before the dynamic ran its full length through you, and the silence did its full work. You know what it feels like to be genuinely, completely yourself in the absence of the gravitational pull of another person's emotional patterns. You know what your attention feels like when it belongs to you, what your days feel like when the low hum of the dynamic is not running underneath everything, what your own desires and preferences and genuine responses to the world feel like when they are not being filtered through the lens of what the dynamic requires of you. This knowledge is irreversible. Once you have inhabited the version of yourself that exists outside the dynamic, the version that existed inside it becomes legible in a new way. You can see it from the outside now. You can see what it was costing, what it was requiring, what it was quietly, persistently asking you to be less of in order to be compatible with a configuration that was never adequately compatible with you. And you can bring that seeing, that clear outside view recognition of what the dynamic asked and what it produced into any future engagement with the avoidant or with anyone else, as a kind of permanent internal reference point. A before and after against which you can measure what a given dynamic is actually asking of you versus what it is actually offering, not as a weapon, as the most practically useful form of self-knowledge available in navigating love. The silence was not the end of your story. It was not the closing chapter of a narrative that was primarily about them and their psychology and their patterns and their eventual ignited recognition of what they were losing. It was a turning point in a story that is primarily about you, about the specific and irreplaceable journey of a person who loved deeply and absorbed much and reached past their own limits and then finally chose the most honest and the most self-respecting thing available. They chose themselves. And in that choosing, in the quiet, unannounced, entirely unglamorous act of simply stopping the reaching and allowing the silence to be real, something was set in motion that had nothing to do with the avoidance response to it. Something internal, something that belongs entirely to you and cannot be affected by whether the ignition leads to genuine change or whether the passion normalizes back to the comfortable level and the cycle reasserts itself. What was set in motion is the version of your life in which you are the primary character rather than the supporting role in someone else's drama of avoidance and return. The version in which your emotional resources are invested in things that invest in return. In which your love, full, genuine, unarmored, completely real, is offered to someone whose capacity to receive it is matched by their willingness to show up for it. In which the silence that you had to find your way through was not the evidence of a love that failed, but the passage that led you to a love that could succeed. That love may or may not include the avoidant who ignited in your absence. That is genuinely unknown and genuinely not the most important question. The most important question is the one about you, about the kind of love you are building toward, about the version of connection you are making yourself available for, about the baseline of what you require and what you will not absorb and what you are carrying as the permanent, earned, absolutely non-negotiable knowledge of your own worth. That baseline is set now, higher than it was before. Not because you decided to raise it as an act of self-protection, because the experience of the dynamic and the silence and the ignition and all of it together showed you in the most visceral and undeniable way available what love looks like when it is not quite reaching you, what it costs to stay in something that is real but insufficient, what you lose of yourself in the long, patient, generous project of loving someone whose patterns keep preventing the love from landing properly. And having seen it, having felt the specific cost of it in your own body, in your own days, in the version of yourself that the dynamic slowly and quietly produced, you simply cannot unsee it, cannot unknown it. Cannot go back to the pre-knowing version of yourself that absorbed the insufficiency as though it were the only thing available. It was not the only thing available, it was simply what was there. And now you know the difference. And knowing the difference, living inside the knowledge of it, carrying it forward into everything that comes next, that is not the consolation prize for a love that could not be what you needed. That is the love, finally, finding its correct address. The correct address is not a destination that announces itself. It does not arrive with the cinematic clarity of a moment in which everything suddenly makes sense and the journey retroactively reveals its purpose and the difficulty is redeemed by the arrival. It is quieter than that, more ordinary, more daily. It arrives in the texture of mornings that begin with your own thoughts rather than with the low hum of the dynamic. In the specific quality of decisions made from genuine preference rather than from the calibrated calculation of what the dynamic can support. In the gradual, almost imperceptible expansion of a life that has been slowly reclaiming the space that the dynamic occupied, you will recognize it not as arrival but as ease. The specific, unfamiliar, slightly disorienting ease of a life that is not organized around managing someone else's emotional climate, of a morning that is simply a morning rather than the beginning of another day of absorbing and adjusting and reaching and waiting. Of a relationship with yourself, with your own interior, with the full and unedited version of what you want and need and feel, that is not being quietly sacrificed on the altar of someone else's comfort. That ease is the address. And getting there did not require the avoidant to change, did not require the ignition to lead anywhere, did not require the passion to sustain, or the return to be genuine, or the dynamic to become what it never quite managed to be. It required only what you gave it. The honest, self-directed, finally complete choosing of yourself over the cycle. There is one more thing worth saying about the silence and what it produces and what it means, and it is the thing that tends to get lost in the complexity of the psychology and the pattern and the ignition and all the layers of what is happening on both sides of the dynamic. The silence was an act of love, not love directed at the avoidant, though it may ultimately serve them in ways that nothing else could. Love directed at yourself, the specific, rare, genuinely demanding form of self-love that is not comfortable or immediately rewarding or recognizable in the early stages as love at all. The form that looks from inside the process more like grief than like love, more like loss than like gaining, more like the terrible, necessary work of stopping something that felt like home even when it was not adequately sheltering you. This is the form of love that is hardest to give yourself and most worth giving, the love that says you deserve more than this specific insufficient configuration, even though this specific insufficient configuration contains things that are real and valuable and not easily replaced. The love that holds the real and valuable things clearly and still chooses, against the pull of them, something more complete, something that does not require you to be less than you are in order to fit inside it. The avoidance passion exploded because your silence was that real, because the love you withdrew from the dynamic was that genuine, because what you were offering all along was something significant enough that its absence ignited something significant in return. But the explosion was never the point. It was always the evidence. Evidence of what was real, evidence of what you brought, evidence that the investment was not the delusion of someone who was loving into a void. It was not a void. It was a defended, frightened, genuinely feeling person who could not yet build a bridge between what they felt and what they showed, who loved you in the dark and withheld it in the light, who wanted the floor to hold and never asked themselves what it cost the floor. Now they know. Now the silence has taught them the thing that nothing else could. Whether that knowledge produces change is their work. Whether you are present for the change, if it comes, is yours. Both of those are true simultaneously. Both of those can be held without one collapsing into the other. Their journey towards becoming someone capable of the love they feel. Your journey toward the love you deserve to receive. Separate journeys. Possibly convergent. Possibly not. But both real, both worth taking, both pointing somewhere that the dynamic in its old form was preventing either of you from reaching. The silence made both journeys possible. Yours by returning you to yourself. Theirs by finally, undeniably, showing them what the cost of their patterns actually looks like when the person absorbing those patterns stops absorbing them. That is what the silence did. That is why it is the only thing that could have done it. Not because withholding is more powerful than giving, but because genuine self-reclamation, the real, unperformed, completely honest withdrawal of someone who finally chose their own wholeness over the maintenance of an insufficient dynamic, is the only force in relational life that reaches past every defense, past every wall, past every carefully managed distance. and lands directly in the place where the truth lives. The truth that you are always worth more than the dynamic was giving you. The truth that the love was always real on both sides and insufficient on one. The truth that you are and were and will remain entirely worth the reaching from someone who can sustain it in the daylight on ordinary days, without the architecture of fear making the reaching conditional on the threat of losing you. That reaching is coming from the right person in the right configuration at the right time, and you will recognize it not by its urgency but by its consistency, not by the explosion of passion activated by loss, but by the quiet, steady, daily choosing of your presence as something worth showing up for. That is what the silence was always building toward. Not the explosion, the arrival.